Let's get myself set up. So this is a really quick dive into the work that I have been doing with Paul Lossy for about the last 2 years, alongside our local biological record centre, Giggle. And this is a project to just sort out various things to do with knowledge about plant life as it stands in the London area. My apologies, I've got a little bit of a cold. So the London area, the Greater London Authority, is like quite a few other major urban conurbations in Britain, overlays the pre-existing kind of geography of the Vice County. So this initial diagram map here shows the outline of Greater London as it currently is with the red line. The circle is the historic circle or the polygon for the London Natural History Society. And you can see both of those overlay the vice counties of South East England and home counties, with my county Middlesex up in the top right-hand corner, or top left-hand corner is looking at the screen for London. So it's a fairly complicated recording area. And this work is really focusing upon the vice county of Middlesex and Greater London. A part of the rationale for doing this was to probably first and foremost give myself a bit of a kick to get moving, to actually start working on the next flora of the London area, because the last flora was published in 1983. And actually it is based upon data collected through the mid-60s into the early 1970s. So we're long overdue a new flora. So doing red lists and axiophyte lists were a useful tool for me starting to get my hand around the kind of scope of the project. And it's a large one because London has a huge amount of non-native species. The other reasons we wanted to do this is because we have, as Jonathan alluded to, an emerging biodiversity crisis in this country, which is getting very serious, and a general lack of awareness, both within the wider society, but also in our planning and local authorities, about biodiversity at a local level. We have pretty good knowledge in this country about national levels of biodiversity, and we have national lists for various things, but we, in many cases, don't have localized lists that actually reflect what's happening, particularly in urban areas. And it's fair to say that the plant life of London is now fundamentally different in many ways to the plant life of the adjoining rural or semi-rural counties that surround, or suburban counties that surround. So we've done this because of a need to actually get on top of actually things which people have heard of, the local nature recovery strategy and biodiversity net gain. Now, I've taken a slightly different approach to many other vice county recorders in that the list I'm doing, the red list or rare plant register and other various language terms that are used, I'm actually using IUCN threat status as my primary piece of information for this. So this is basically a hierarchical thing where we have least concern, near threatened, vulnerable to extinction, endangered, critically extinction, regionally extirpated in the wild, and extirpated. Now, the reason I'm using these terms is because, frankly, in many ways, they actually read better to the non-scientist in terms of the urgency of the problem. Saying something is scarce or rare, it's a status quo in many respects. It doesn't really imply trends and other things which are really the drivers to what's happening in our planet. So I've actually adopted this, although we'll also be talking about rarity in the finalized red list. And as I've alluded to, hope the main reason for doing this is to provide tools for local authorities, developers, land managers to actually look at this data and use it to inform their land management and their planning decisions, etc., etc. So the axiophyte list, which I'll dive into in a bit more detail, has now been completed and is available online. We have it online in 2 locations, on our local biological records centre website. Oh, actually 3, and the BSBI website under my vice county and Henry's vice county, and also on the London Natural History Society website. So the data is now widely available and is starting to be taken up by people to be used and explore. So, and one last little thing which came out as an idea through the process of doing this work is developing potentially localized important plant areas for the Greater London area. Now, This is work that was largely done by Paul Lossy from Salix Ecology and alongside data sets provided by our local Biological Records Centre, with a little bit of extra interrogation by me from looking at the BSBI databases, because we're still in the process of trying to get all of our data for all the vice counties in the London area into one place. My apologies, there's quite a lot of data and text in this talk, which is unusual for me. Normally I have lots of pretty pictures. So we identified, in terms of the axiophytes, our indicator species of high quality habitat, species that were occurring in 25% or less monads, or fewer rather, monads in the Greater London, therefore excluding very common and widespread species. We also excluded a very large number of rarities, where species were really only occurring in 1 or 2 monads and essentially were red list species. So in many cases, our red list and our axiophyte lists are actually mutually exclusive, although a few are actually on both lists. And the axiophytes have been selected for all the key kind of priority habitats that are important. One of the challenges around this is that local authorities and regional authorities such as Greater London don't use quite the same terms as UK HAB, for example, or other forms of habitat categorization. So we've had to go through a process of trying to smooth the terminology to make it readable to as many people as possible. The other thing with Greater London and many urban areas, which is a massive problem, is that many species which would classify as an axiophyte, such as marsh marigold, because they're widespread plants and wetland habitats, for example, essentially don't make the grade in the London area. Because in the case of marsh marigold, it's incredibly frequently planted. Vast majority of populations in the London area are non-native, and certain species such as this we've excluded. In fact, marsh marigold is probably heading towards extinction in much of the Greater London area. This has resulted in 484 axiophyte species for, I think, about 20 habitats that we defined. So that data, as I say, are now available online. Now, Paul did some additional work to just see how well our axiophyte list was working. You know, did it really reflect what was on the ground in terms of London's designated habitats and the coverage? So this table provides an analysis of the various kind of designations, from triple SIs to sites of metropolitan importance, such as the metropolitan sites or borough habitats or local habitats. And if you just move to the right-hand side, you can see that in the round, we're actually doing quite well in the London area for actually getting coverage of our sites at various levels for actually encapsulating vulnerable species in the London area. So we're doing well in terms of landscape capture of these species into these important sites. But frankly, it's fair to say in many cases, these sites are actually dwindling in quality through lack of resources, et cetera, et cetera. But at least in paper, this looks like we're doing well. Now, moving into the red list, and this is work that I've been primarily leading on, and I'm still doing. This has been a pretty large task, and we're hoping to get this list out later this year. I analysed over 1,400 taxa, species, infraspecific species, and hybrids. And actually then overall, this was in a wider list of 3,600 odd species, including a huge amount of neophytes. Now, the take-home message is that actually London's wild plant life, both native and archaeophyte, is in a very, very bad state. We have 347 species which are essentially critically endangered or vulnerable in the Greater London area, 170 or thereabouts, which are completely extinct. And frankly, I think this is probably a conservative estimate. I suspect the figure could be closer to 250. It's really not good. And then we have, even at a GB level, a wide number of species, 156 or thereabout, which are considered near threatened or above in the GB level, which are significantly higher level of risk in the regional area. And then a wide number, hundreds more, of species which are least concerned nationally, which are really doing very, very poorly in the Greater London area. This work has actually drawn and highlighted the challenges of existing lists in an area, because the current Greater London priority species list, this includes things such as NERC species, this is section 41, and other species of conservation importance, is currently doing very, very badly at actually covering and acknowledging London's threatened and rare and endangered species. Thankfully, it's fair to say that the GLA have acknowledged the limitations of the current list, and hopefully when the final red list is produced, it will be the basis of further actions in the London area, teams at the very least recognising the value and importance of these plants. So what we're seeing, not surprisingly, we know we're seeing declines across England and Wales and Scotland and across the northwestern Europe, but actually in urban areas, declines are particularly significant and intense. Here's some data from the BSBI maps. On the left-hand side are essentially all of the data over the last 300 years or so for the Greater London area for harebell, Campanula rotundifolia, and then the post-2020 records on the right. Now, you can see from this that there's been quite a significant decline, and it's fair to say those dots that you see on the right hand in many ways are a graphic overrepresentation of the abundance of those plants. In many cases, it could be singleton clumps, and the population is essentially doomed. And frankly, sometimes in cases, because of the challenges of people not always recording whether something is planted or introduced, a fair number of these records, particularly in inner London, are also going to be horticultural introductions and or maybe in some cases misidentifications. So Campanula rotundifolia, not surprisingly, because we know it's in challenges, is doing badly nationally, is doing very badly in the London area. So it has been a least concern historically for the GB red list. It's actually recently gone to near threatened for England. Now, part of the reason for the challenges around this is we have two subspecies in Britain, which are poorly defined, and we haven't got a good handle around that. And I think it's very, very important in the future that we start focusing on subspecies, because in many cases, they have separate threats to what you look at a species level. And in this particular case, harebell has actually been designated as one of our axiophytes for calcareous grassland, and also, frankly, acid grassland. In fact, our strongest populations are probably on acid grassland in the London area. And it is, not surprisingly, listed as vulnerable for the Greater London area as a whole. VC21 is most certainly endangered. We've probably got only one or two sites where it really is doing quite well. Excuse me, a quick sip of water. Oh, I just noticed a spelling mistake. In Erica cineraria, that should be an A on the end. Similarly, plants of nutrient poor habitat, other plants of nutrient habitat such as bell heather are doing very badly. And you can see again, the Vice County 21, my Vice County and Henry's Vice County, it is now an endangered species with very, very few sites. You can see from this map, I've actually merged all the data for the three widespread heather species in southeastern England. And we have very, very few areas where there are probably sort of sufficient populations for these species to survive in structural communities that we would recognise as heathland in the Greater London area. So heathlands are really, really under pressure, and the plants within them, which leads on to the potential from these data. Now that we know which species are really in trouble in the London area, we can start focusing on identifying, along with existing maps that have been produced by a local biological records centre, on focusing and identifying important plant areas for the Greater London area. And certain areas such as Richmond, which is down in the southwest as you look at the map here, is notably important, but there are also very, very important areas in the east of London around the Thames Gateway. So we're hopefully going to start working probably sometime after next year on actually developing important plant areas for the Greater London area. Next steps, Ultimately, we now know which species in London are really in trouble. We need to start doing species-specific surveys for the ones that are most at risk. Here's one of my favourites. The populations of spring squill in southeast England are genetically different and distinct from the populations in southwest England, and they're much, much more vulnerable. They're in many cases in a poor state, and the habitats are quite heavily degraded. Thankfully, in Vice County 21, Middlesex, we have one strong and healthy population at Hampton Court. So we need to do a lot more species surveys for the 200 or so species that we think are really significantly at risk in the London area, which is a huge task. Thank you very much. And if there's time, questions.